Welcome to the QME podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan, and this show is all about the first time we saw ourselves represented in media and how that moment shaped the way we see ourselves today. Whether it was a character, a scene, or even a passing moment, QME is a space for LGBTQ plus voices to reflect on what it meant to be seen or sometimes to not be seen at all. On this episode, I'll be sharing my own story. It's one I've carried with me for years about an unexpected moment during a real world marathon that left a lasting impact. But before I jump into that, I want to give you a little background on where this podcast idea even came from. As someone who grew up constantly looking for reflections of myself in shows, movies, music, honestly anything, I often came up short. And now, even more as queer stories are being told, we're also watching LGBTQ plus content get pulled, defunded, or erased. So I wanted to create a space where those stories, especially from voices that don't always get the spotlight, could live, be remembered, and be honored. The name Cue came from the idea of waiting for your moment, like calling out to the world, Cue me, I'm ready to be seen. It's also a nod to a clapboard moment before a scene starts. You know, the little clapboard, the kind of moment that says, you matter, the camera's rolling, and your story is worth telling. Cue Me isn't just about nostalgia, it's about the power of media to help us feel seen and how those moments still echo in who we are today. So now that you know where the podcast idea came from, I want to share the moment that sparked it all for me. It's a story I've never fully told like this before, but it's one that stayed with me. Because long before I had the words to describe who I was or what I was feeling, there was this moment that quietly carved itself into my memory. It didn't come from a big coming out scene or some groundbreaking movie. It came during a real world marathon. One of those long MTV reruns I used to get pulled into, and someone who completely shifted how I saw myself. This is the first time I saw me. The first time I saw anyone that echoed anything close enough to who I was. And that really stuck with me. So let me take you back to that moment. It was 2002. I was 11. I was at home flipping through channels, probably avoiding homework, when I landed on an old marathon of The Real World on MTV. They were replaying episodes from one of the early seasons, season 3. Yeah, San Francisco, which originally aired in 1994. That season followed 7 strangers living in a house together, and one of them was Pedro Zamora. He was a Cuban American AIDS educator and one of the very first openly gay HIV positive men on mainstream American television. Pedro didn't share a home with his castmates, he shared his life. He openly spoke about his HIV status, his activism, and his relationship with his partner, Sean. And he did it all with so much grace and strength at a time when even saying the word gay on TV still felt risky. Seeing him, Latino, just like me, gay, which at the time I wasn't sure what I was, but I can tell you I was gay. Even then I was. And he was unafraid. Seeing that stopped me in my tracks because I hadn't seen anyone like that before, not in a way that felt real, not just because it was the real world, but real, you know? And so I believe that seeing him on TV was so out of the ordinary for me. It was seeing someone who had a voice, who stood for something that wasn't acceptable, I would say at the time. So, as you have to keep in mind, I was 11 years old at the time, And I was unaware of my own queerness. I was unaware of what I can do with just being myself. And seeing this on the screen really showed a way for me to highlight yourself, to shout out, hey, this is who I am, accept me. This is me advocating for those who don't have a voice. This is me standing up against the stigma. And I was mesmerized by seeing someone like him on my screen. And then came something else. What came with the shock of seeing someone being so proud also came with the highlighting of the fear. I said, wait a minute, this guy, he's gay, he's proud, he doesn't hide who he is, but he has HIV. At the time, there was no treatment to prevent the contraction of HIV. You know, it was peak epidemic for HIV AIDS. And so his HIV turned into AIDS. And so that sparked a fear in me where there was joy at the same time. There was a another part of me that was like, wait a minute. So if I can be my true self, if I can be proud, and if I can stand up and not be ashamed of who I am, there's still a possibility that this can be me through being proud. But at the same time, there is this fear that comes with, well, he's being punished for being gay. He's getting AIDS. And that's what happens to gay people. So that sat with me. And I dwelled on that fear for a little bit. For a long time, that fear stayed with me. I couldn't separate Pedro's pride from his diagnosis. In my young mind, being gay and getting HIV felt like two sides of the same coin. What made it even more complicated was seeing Pedro and his partner Sean have a commitment ceremony on screen. Something I've never seen on TV before. Keep in mind, marriage between the same sex wasn't legal at that time. So they had a commitment ceremony. It was beautiful. It was real. It was proof that love between two men could exist with tenderness and dignity. But then I learned that Pedro died shortly after the season aired. And as a kid, I I didn't have the language or the context to process that. All I saw was someone who lived openly, who dared to be seen, and someone who didn't survive. It was heartbreaking, and it planted a fear deep inside me that being gay meant living under a shadow, that pride might be punished, that if I ever lived truthfully, I might also live with a countdown. That belief stayed with me for a long time, but it began to shift once I got older and started meeting people in real life who were living with HIV, people who were healthy, thriving, and in full control of their lives. I saw that HIV wasn't a death sentence. It was something that wasn't shameful. It was a virus, one that people live with, manage, and continue to love and be loved. That fear I had as a kid began to dissolve, and in its place came something else. The realization that Pedro wasn't a cautionary tale. He was a pioneer. He was someone who used the time he had to change the world. And even now, over 20 years later, I still carry that moment with me. So let's Let's take a step back and talk about what that moment means now. Looking back now, I can see how much Pedro shaped the way I understood queerness, pride, and loss, all at the same time. At 11 years old, I didn't have that language, but I felt the weight. His visibility gave me something I didn't even know I needed, but it also came wrapped in grief, stigma, and in silence. It took me years to untangle that, to realize that the fear I carried wasn't mine to hold. It was something that had been passed down through the media, through my community, through the absence of real conversations. And now I see Pedro's story differently. I see it as brave, yes, but I also see it as loving, human, and complicated in the most honest way. He wasn't a warning, he was a reminder that being visible matters, that telling the truth, even when it's hard, can create real change. I think about how far we've come since then, but also how much we're still fighting for. LGBTQ plus stories are still being erased. Stigma still exists. Queer people, especially black and brown queer people, are being asked to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. And that's why I wanted to start this podcast here with the memory that first showed me that what visibility looked like and what it could cost, but also what it could spark. If if I could go back and talk to that 11-year-old version of myself sitting in front of the TV, confused, afraid, and mesmerized, I'd tell him this. You're not broken. You're not alone. You're going to grow into someone who uses his voice to uplift others. And you'll finally understand that seeing yourself in media doesn't fix everything, but it can start something. And looking at media today, what's out there now, I can't help but think about how much has changed and how much hasn't. We've come a long way. Queer stories aren't just hidden anymore. They're sometimes celebrated, produced, even centered. We've had shows like Pose, Veneno, Heartstopper, Sex Education, and of course, RuPaul's Drag Race, my favorite actually, which has become this massive global platform that showcases so many different expressions of queerness and artistry all in one. That kind of visibility would have blown my mind as a kid. And honestly, I love what Drag Race has done to push drag into the mainstream and to make queer creativity impossible to ignore. But even with all of that, we're still kind of stuck in this loop. The stories that get the biggest budgets or the longest runtime or are often centered on cis cisgendered white gay men. The same thing over and over, the same kind of coming out story, the same romantic plots. They're just repackaged again and again. Meanwhile, shows led by queer people of color, by trans and non binary folk, by people living at those intersections, those shows are either underfunded, canceled early, or buried by the algorithm. And that's not just disappointing, it's erasure dressed up as progress. It's here's a little bit of what you can get, but you could only get it our way. You could only get what we allow you. That's like I said, erasure dressed up as progress because representation doesn't mean anything if it's only ever just one kind of story. We need new stories, maybe even messy stories, stories that reflect all the different ways that queerness shows up across culture, race, gender, language, and body. We don't just want visibility, we want complexity. We want honesty. We want the truth. We want our stories, our way. That's what Cue Me is here for, to hold space for the first time we saw ourselves and to make space for the stories that still haven't been told. If Pedro was my first cue, maybe, maybe this podcast is one for someone else. Pedro didn't get to see the ripple effects of what he started, but I'm part of that ripple. His story helped me begin to understand my own, and now it's part of why I tell my story. Not because I have all the answers, but because I know how much it meant to just see someone try. He reminded me that even in the face of fear, visibility can be an act of love. And if his moment helped shape me, then maybe sharing mine can help someone else. So, if this episode reminded you of your own first moment, that first time you saw someone and thought, wait, that might be me, I want you to hold on to that because those moments matter, even if they're complicated. They don't always come wrapped in joy. Sometimes they come with grief or confusion or silence. But even then, they plant something. They open a door. Pedro did that for me. His presence on screen made a young version of me feel visible, even if I wasn't ready to admit it. And that's the power of media, not to fix us, not to give us all the answers, but to make us feel like we're not alone in the questions. That's why I'm doing this, because if there's someone out there right now waiting for their cue, maybe this podcast can help hold the space until they're ready to take it. So whether you've already had your cue me moment or you're waiting to see yourself fully, you're welcome here. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Cue Me. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear yours. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok at CueMe Podcast. That's CUEME Podcast. Or visit CueMePodcast.com, where you can find full episodes, guest stories, and more. I'll be back next episode with our first guest. And trust me, it's a good one. Until then, keep watching, keep remembering, and keep showing up.